Emeritus Fiorenza, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us for this joyous celebration. First, let us congratulate Cardinal-designate Wuerl on his wonderful honors in the Holy Father. We are really very privileged to be able to join this celebration, not only because the Cardinal-designate, of course, has joined us, but also to recognize the labors and dedication of one of our own. And Father Donald Heston has been part of our university community for over 17 years. And during that time, he has labored in the vineyards of Houston. There are vineyards in Houston. He has labored in the vineyards with patience and determinations, with countless seminars, workshops, lectures, presentations. And now he has taken all that and put it together as something that truly has lasting value. And that is a Master of Arts of Faith and Culture. What more important topic could we think of than how our Catholic faith intersects and sometimes wrestles with our American culture. And this is the whole issue, this is the whole concept behind this wonderful program. So I'd like to now introduce Father Donald Heston, who will introduce our guest. Please welcome him and thank him for what he has done to create this event.
There is only one thing accurate that Dr. Ivan said, and that is that I was in the vineyard. And there is no more appropriate place for an Italian origin American than in the vineyard. I want to welcome you this evening. I see all of these faces of my students and fellow faculty members and all of the wonderful friends and people who have supported the Center for Faith and Culture over the years, and it's truly with a very warm, affectionate heart that I want to welcome you here tonight. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that what we are celebrating tonight is not me, but this is indeed a celebration. When I was thinking about the metaphor that I would use to describe what we're doing here tonight, it's the Greek idea of a symposium. And a symposium is a wonderful celebratory meal where people get together and they talk, they exchange ideas, they probe the questions about the meaning of life and all of the wonderful things that we can achieve through reason and human effort, and so forth. And this is truly a symposium for us. It's a celebration, but we add one component to that, and that is the component of our faith. I'm going to take a few moments, longer than usual, to make this introduction, and I've already asked the indulgence of Cardinal-designate. May I just say Cardinal? Designate makes it too complicated. To Cardinal Wuerl, to allow us to do this, allow me to do this, and with his indulgence and yours, there are some things I think that I would like to put before you, to put this in a context which is not going to take away from his talk, but which is really truly going to embellish what he's going to say to us. What we're celebrating tonight is the growth in the Church's consciousness of the mission of God that has been entrusted to her, namely, to incarnate the love of God as revealed in Christ into every way of life developed by the human race. That's the significance of the incarnation. Christ did this, and he has shown us how to do it well. He has called us to bring good news, to evangelize, to the ends of the earth, and by the power of divine love, to transform a broken world that groans in its longing for fulfillment. So tonight, we celebrate that under the inspiration of the Divine Spirit, the Second Vatican Council, for the first time in the history of the Church, calls the Church to place human culture at the center of its missionary and pastoral life. It is in the context of cultures, people's ways of life, that the Second Vatican Council tells us that the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of people of this age, especially those who are poor and in any way afflicted, are also recognized as the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. As the Council says, indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in the hearts of Christians. We also celebrate tonight Pope Paul VI, who made this conciliar teaching a principal characteristic of his pontificate and called the Church to be a master of dialogue, as was the incarnate Word. His apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Nuntiandi, the evangelization of the peoples, provides the bedrock understanding of the meaning and the means to bring to all strata of society the truth that God continues to so love this world that he sends his Son to it through the Church, the people of God. We celebrate the fact that Paul VI had made all the preparations to establish the Pontifical Council for Culture prior to his death, and that one of the first acts of Pope John Paul II after his election was to implement it, a clear sign that the major theme of the Council was to be given prominence in his pontificate. There are two encyclical letters of John Paul II that we also celebrate tonight. The flagship encyclical, Redeemer of Man. In that he says that Paul VI was his father, and that Paul VI was his model for evangelizing through the ministry of the dialogue of salvation. And the other encyclical that we celebrate is his Mission of Christ the Redeemer, in which he clarifies how the Church must bring the message of divine love to those peoples who have not yet heard the message. That's what we call the mission ad gentes. But he also says that we must be prepared to carry out a new evangelization in countries with ancient Christian roots that have, quote, lost a living sense of the faith, or even no longer consider themselves members of the Church, and live a life far removed from Christ and his gospel. The Pope recognized that this evangelization and process of inculturation is a lengthy one. It is not a matter of purely external adaptation, for inculturation means the intimate transformation of authentic cultural values through their integration in Christianity and the insertion of Christianity in the various human cultures. And he says, the process is thus a profound and all-embracing one. This new evangelization, the evangelization of cultures, is probably the greatest challenge for us in the American context. It means not only to bring transforming divine love to individuals, but most importantly, to the institutions which contain our self-understanding, family, education, government, legal systems, and the rest. Pope Benedict XVI, in establishing the new dicastery for evangelization, has highlighted once again the Church's passion for the dialogue of enculturation in presenting the essence of Christianity, the risen Christ, God's agape to the world for the transformation of all strata of humanity. All of this is cause for celebrating the inspiration of the Holy Spirit working in the Church. But there is even more. The theory has to be implemented. It was 16 years ago when President Emeritus Joe McFadden, former academic vice president Lee Williams, and Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza were presented with the idea of establishing a Center for Faith and Culture at the University of St. Thomas to implement the teaching of the Council and the recent popes. The three of them collaborated with great enthusiasm to make it a reality. And we recognize the continuing support of our present president, Dr. Ivany, and Dr. Aquila, the academic vice president, for locating the center on the campus at UST. Over the past 16 years, the center has been true to its mission, which it says is seeking to understand and affect the relationship between the gospel and the American way of life in relation to God's ongoing encounter with humanity in the light of faith. Through dialogue, it assists participants to live as faithful citizens in our democratic republic. It brings a Catholic voice to the ongoing conversation about the meaning of life and the liberty and the pursuit of happiness we hold in common as Americans. And without the generous help of innumerable friends and benefactors, we could never have carried out this mission over the past 16 years. Just to name a few: the Graduate School of Theology, St. Mary's Seminary, various faculty members at UST, and other Houston universities, students, volunteers, the Basilians, and my own congregation, the Congregation of the Holy Spirit. Given these reasons for celebrating, it should be obvious why this evening's event is an important moment for UST, the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston, for the Church in the United States, and also for the way of life in our republic. This university, by establishing the new Master of Arts degree in Faith and Culture, offers to people, all people of goodwill, the opportunity to join us in doing what we do best, namely, to appreciate the way of life we espouse as citizens of this wonderful country, but also to offer the liberating message of the gospel, the Catholic voice, to all aspects of our way of life as it is embodied in our democratic institutions. We often say that it takes a village to raise a child. The creation and development of the master's program has truly been a communitarian affair. We would not be here celebrating its existence tonight without the collaboration of the Office of the Vice President of Academic Affairs, the Dean and faculty of the Graduate School of Theology, faculty from various departments within the university, the collaboration of the Master of Liberal Studies program, several Brazilian fathers, and the intense efforts of the Associate Director of the Center for Faith and Culture, Dr. Adam Martinez, and our Assistant Director of Admission Administration, Ms. Jan Skrihat. Their generous collaboration made it happen, and the fruits of their efforts are witnessed in our first cohort of students. And I want the students to stand up and be recognized. Please stand up. They're over here. Thank you. It is for these reasons that we celebrate with joy the fact that our speaker accepted our invitation to speak to us this evening on the subject of religious faith's role in building a good and just society. Before I came in, somebody said, "You asked for an archbishop and you got a cardinal." You either have to be lucky or Italian or a lucky Italian. And I said, "It's both, believe me." He is a man who is deeply in touch with the pulse of the Holy Spirit in the church and the cultures of the world. As a young priest, he had first-hand experience of the sessions of the Second Vatican Council. He was a seminarian in Rome for 3 sessions. In his service to Cardinal John Wright, he had proximate experience of a conclave when he accompanied Cardinal Wright to the conclave that elected Pope John Paul II. He's recognized for his passion to communicate the gospel through his writings, including the best-selling catechisms, The Teaching of Christ, and The Catholic Way. This also can be seen in his most recent pastoral letter on Catholic education, Looking to the Future with Confidence. As Archbishop of our nation's capital, he is also at the heartbeat of the political life of our nation. I don't know whether that's a plus or minus. As Chancellor of the Catholic University of America and Chairman of the Board of the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center, as Chair of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Doctrine, and a member of the USCCB's Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis, he is at the forefront of the new evangelization. Most recently, he has been named by Pope Benedict XVI as the delegate for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith for the implementation of Anglicanorum Cetibus, a pastoral provision for entry of Anglicans into the Catholic communion. So you understand why Archbishop Cardinal Wuerl is the perfect speaker for our celebration and the inauguration of our new master's degree in faith and culture. In his reflection, he will certainly provide us with ways to live the ministry of bringing together the heart of the nation and the heart of God in Christ. Now, before I want you to welcome him, there's one other thing I want to do. I have dedicated the work in the Center for Faith and Culture for the past 17 years to Mary, the Mother of God. Would you stand and we will sing the Salve Regina. Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, et spes nostra salve. A te clamamus, exules Filii Eve, a te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in ac lacrimarum valle. Ea ergo, advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos ad nos converte, et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende. O clemens, O pia, O dulcis Virgo Maria. Let us welcome our Cardinal Wuerl.
It is truly a privilege and a joy to join all of you for this This inaugural lecture, which really recognizes the establishment of the new master's degree in faith and culture as a part of this Center for Faith and Culture at the University of St. Thomas. And I'm particularly grateful to the invitation of Father Donald Nesty, the director of the center and a longtime friend from our days together in Pittsburgh when I was rector of the seminary and he was the president of Duquesne University. It's a joy to be here with you, Father Nesty, and to recognize the work that you have accomplished here. I also want to acknowledge your Archbishop, His Eminence Cardinal-designate, also a long-standing friend going back to our days as priests together in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. In saluting Cardinal Donato, I also want to thank him for his leadership. His leadership not only here in this church, but his leadership in our Conference of Bishops and therefore throughout the country. Your Eminence, thank you so very, very much. I also want to recognize the Archbishop Emeritus, Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza, and thank him for years and years of devoted service, not just to this church, but to our Conference of Bishops as president, and through that office to the whole church in the United States. Thank you so very much. I also want to recognize Dr. Robert Ivany, the president of the university, and thank him for what he has accomplished here at this outstanding university. I've been asked to address the topic that is at the very heart of this whole idea of culture and faith, and why we would have a center for culture and faith, this new master's degree program which articulates the center. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss with you the long-standing role of faith in our American culture, and particularly the gift that religious faith brings to the effort to build a good and just society. The topic is all the more appropriate because a Catholic university, this very institution, participates in that challenging task of helping the students who matriculate here answer the great questions of life. How shall I live? What's the purpose of life? What's the goal of life? And all of that is answered in the context of the society and culture in which we live. This campus is a home of learning, a place where intellectual development occurs and academic excellence provides a gauge against which one can measure personal achievement. That's a long and elaborate way of saying, at the end of the day, there are exams. There's a way to measure a norm against which our academic achievement is measured. But we're aware, in all of this academic activity, we're aware that we live in a highly scientific, technological, and information-oriented world. Life at a university is an invitation to learn and appropriate so much of the information and the data available to us. But there's more. There's much more. We need to know as well what to do with all of the information, all of the data that we accumulate, that we pass on, that we develop. We need to make judgments about how to use what we know. There's a great distinction between knowledge, information, the accumulation of data, and wisdom. In one of those many dramatizations of the life of Henry VIII, and there are so many of them, there's a scene where St. Thomas More is being led from the room where he has just been sentenced to the Tower. And on the way, he meets the successor to his previously held office as Chancellor of the realm. And the Chancellor had obtained this position by helping the king achieve what the king wanted, a divorce. And More says to Cromwell, "You have made a dreadful mistake." And Cromwell says to More, "I've made the mistake. I'm Chancellor. You're on your way to prison." And More replies, "Your task as advisor to the king is to tell him what he ought to do. He already knows what he can do. Your job is to tell him what he ought to do." In the world in which we live, science, technology, human capability, and therefore political opportunities and new avenues of government intervention and direction in our lives are moving at such a rapid pace that they run the risk of outstripping the very important ethical and moral reflections that have to accompany everything that is part of the human condition. Too often, what results is what we can do, and not necessarily what we ought to do. But as soon as we enter into the world of ought, we enter into the realm of moral and ethical reflection. A critical factor in the process is the norm against which we would measure something, the norm against which we would measure our scientific capability, our technological ability, when we make judgments about their use. It's at this point that we encounter the impact of culture, the impact of society, the impact, the importance of the context of what we're about to do. And therefore, we encounter the significance, the profound human significance of wisdom passed on in our Christian culture. The distinction between what we're learning and are able to do and the accumulated wisdom of centuries of reflecting on the gospel in the light of the Holy Spirit. At this point, we recognize how well served we are as a church by that received tradition that we cherish. A received tradition that allows us to answer those great questions. A couple of years ago, I was on a flight, and from my aisle seat, I could see this great discussion going on in the galley of the plane. All the flight attendants were there, and it was an animated discussion. And at a certain point, one of the flight attendants came back and hunkered down in the aisle right across facing me and said, "You're a Catholic priest, right?" And I admitted I was. And she said, "I have a question for you." And I thought, with the tone of this question, I sure hope I have an answer. And she said, "What does the Catholic Church understand by the second coming of Christ?" I thought, I hope it has nothing to do with this flight. But I gave her my little thumbnail sketch of the second coming. And whatever I said came down on her side of the argument, because she immediately stood up and she said, "Thank you," and went back to the galley. And the man in the seat next to me said, "How did you know that?" And as I started to respond, he said, No, I assume you went to school." No, thank you. "How did you know what you told her was true?" The answer to that question brings you and me into direct encounter with what we call the great received tradition. And it's out of that great received tradition that we attempt to face all of the new issues today, technological capabilities, scientific advances. Our Holy Father Pope John Paul II said in the Apostolic Constitution Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, a Catholic university's privileged position is to unite existentially by intellectual activity two orders of reality that too frequently are placed in opposition as though they were antithetical. The search for truth and the certainty of already knowing the font of truth. We come to a university and we engage in all of the scientific and academic activity that is a part of seeking truth, knowing we already are connected to the font of truth. In his address to Catholic educators in April 2008, when our Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, visited our country, at the Catholic University of America, he noted that all the Church's activities stem from her awareness that she is the bearer of a message which has God as its origin. Culture, human culture, the culture that is nurtured in the experience of human life. And that experience includes the knowledge of God, the revelation of God. Culture is the cradle of our history, our story, our identity. And it necessarily includes our religious experience, our faith life. As we begin to examine how we are to respond to the issues of today, we need to reflect then on the context, the home of our self-identification, our culture. The self-identification of all of us in a land made up of so many different backgrounds. We meet today in an archdiocese that can trace its roots all the way back to the appointment of a vicar apostolic of Texas in 1842. But long prior to that, the faith was lived thanks to the intrepid efforts of early missionaries in Texas. I exercise my pastoral ministry as shepherd of a flock in the Archdiocese of Washington, which contains within its boundaries St. Mary's County, the location of the first Catholic colony in the English-speaking world. Maryland was the first colony to provide statutory guarantee for personal and institutional religious freedom. And these elements of our local experience here in Texas and in southern Maryland are fortuitous reminders of the place of religious faith in our nation's history, locally, regionally, and nationally. As you know, there's a statue in the United States Capitol building representing the history of each of the states. When I served in the western state, the other Washington, the western state of Washington, I was always very proud of the fact that the one statue allotted our state was Mother Joseph, a sister of Charity of Providence, who was considered one of the pioneers in the formation of the early life of the state of Washington because of her work as a religious, as an architect, as a contractor, as a designer, as a teacher, as a hospital administrator. Faith permeated everything she did. And that state in its early days recognized you can't speak of who we are apart from knowing who Mother Joseph was. The state of Hawaii is represented by the recently canonized saint of the lepers, Damien de Veuster. Representing California, under the dome of the Capitol of the United States, is the statue of Junipero Serra. It's hard to imagine another person who has left such a mark on any state in the Union as this quiet, modest, faith-filled Franciscan whose footsteps left in their wake what are now communities all along the coast of California. Take a look at the road map and you think you're reading the Litany of Saints. The church buildings, the temples, the synagogues that dot the landscape of this nation do more than simply remind us of our faith history. They also proclaim how deeply embedded religious faith is in our culture and in our vision of human dignity, moral imperative, and the purpose of life. Those buildings where the faithful, the citizens of this land gather, those buildings provide the frame of reference for the way in which we think, the way in which we deal with issues, the way in which we respond societally to our problems. The recently concluded PBS series God in America, while woefully limited, as it seriously understates the role of the Catholic Church in the nation, nonetheless points out the impact of religious faith on our United States culture from its beginning. With religious faith comes a way of living, a set of standards for moral and civil behavior, and those expectations of conduct that are woven into the very fabric of the land. It's those expectations that form the framework of our thinking of right and wrong. You shall not kill is not simply a legal construct, a convention of a particular political tendency. It's a moral imperative rooted in our human nature, proclaimed by our religious heritage, and intrinsic to the very identity of ourselves as a people. As we reflect on the place of religion in our country's history, I want to recognize the wide breadth of religious traditions in which Americans today draw inspiration, a huge breadth. The great diversity of religious experience only enhances our nation and its collective effort to express itself in public policy. And while noting this rich tradition, I intend this evening simply to focus on the Catholic Church and its impact for two reasons. One, if we tried to do all of them, we'd be here all night. And two, the Catholic tradition is the one I know. But when we look at this, when we look at the impact of faith, we come to realize who we are, how we think, how we respond, draws its inspiration from that religious tradition. Recently, in the question and answer period of a presentation I had on a similar theme at a secular university last May, when we came to the question and answer period, a man put up his hand. The moderator, who was seated right alongside me, said, "Trouble." He went to the microphone and he said, "What is it you people think you bring to our society?" The "you people" meant not just me, but in the front row were representatives of all of these various faith traditions. That was the whole purpose of this program. And they were there in their vestments and dress. They said, "I understand from the moderator that you're on the faculty of the law school." He said, I am. And I describe myself, he said, as a functional atheist. I didn't know what to make of that, but I didn't want to go down that road much further. I said, "Well, as a lawyer, you know that you never ask a question, the answer of which you don't already know. And so do you mind if I respond to your question with another question?" And he said, "Feel free." So I said to him, "What would it be like? What would this country be like if we were not the heirs to a millennia of religious instruction, going all the way back to the Ten Commandments? What if we were not the heirs of the Sermon on the Mount, what if we didn't know as a people Matthew's account of the Last Judgment? What if we had never heard and never tried to put into practice Jesus' command to love one another as I have loved you? Where would we be? And to his credit, he said, we'd be in a mess. Bidding the Pope farewell at Birmingham's airport as he concluded his trip to Scotland and England, as the Pope prepared to leave, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, said that the Pope's message on the importance of faith in molding the moral character of a nation had resonated far beyond Britain's minority Catholic population. He said, quote, "You have spoken to a nation of 6 million Catholics, but you have been heard by a nation of more than 60 million citizens and by many millions all over the world." And then he went on to say, "You have really challenged the whole country to sit up and think, and that can only be a good thing." Earlier, the Pope spoke at an outdoor mass at a park in Birmingham where he reminded the people of England and Scotland, theirs is a Christian history. The Pope reminded his listeners the very identity of Britain is found in the Christian faith. There is no England without the Christian heritage, historically. The same can be said of us and our American culture, our identity as a people, our identity as a people who form this nation. Looking back over our history, the threads of religious experience are woven into the very fabric of our national identity. In looking at the place of religion in our country's history, we turn to at least 3 areas for consideration. First, we need to consider the long-standing recognition of the manner in which the voice of faith has served in the past and continues to serve today as the conscience of our society. This action is seen in particular in the influence of the Church's social justice teaching on the social legislation of our nation. The impact of well-articulated faith-based principles have most evidently helped to form public policy in the United States in the area of human dignity, in the improvement of the working conditions that were a routine part of the life of Americans for our grandparents and maybe even our parents. The Church brought to the debate the strongest moral voice when we had to deal with issues of child labor, working conditions, the hours that a person would be forced to work. Most of the social legislation of the 30s and 40s found its moral foundation and its philosophical formulation in the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Today, our struggle is to achieve the same structures, the same success, echoing John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae, a defense of human life in all its forms, from conception to natural death. Our founding fathers wrote of the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights, they said, were endowed by God, our Creator. This grew out of our understanding of who we are. This didn't come from a legislature that conferred those rights. But secondly, we must note that the all too familiar current secular drive to subordinate religious faith to secular principles and to bleach out religion and religious influence from our contemporary society. This movement claims to be the only legitimate player on the field of our nation's response to the multiple and grave challenges of our day. And the third point we're going to look at as we move forward, how do we assess and assert the role of faith in our contemporary American society, recognizing the integral contribution of faith, religion, and church to our American culture. In addressing religious faith's role as the conscience of a good and just society, we should be all the more conscious of our rootedness, because we cannot become isolated from our connectedness and expect to flourish. As a people, we have a need to be part of a living unity with roots and a lived experience with a history, and because of our history, a future. Our lives as individuals and as a society are diminished to the extent that we allow ourselves to be cut off or disconnected from that which identifies us and, more importantly, nurtures us as a culture, as a society, as a people. I want to turn our attention to the manner in which religious faith has served and continues to serve as the conscience of our society. In 1620, before they even left the deck of that tiny little ship that brought the pilgrims to the coast of New England, before they left that deck and ventured ashore, these earliest English-speaking European colonists reached an agreement, historically known as the Mayflower Compact. And they thus determined that they would recognize two principles in their societal life as they began to construct a whole new form of government. Two principles by which their freedom would be guided: the law of God and the common good. Those intrepid men and women, after a long and cold sea journey to our shores, didn't rush to the land immediately. They paused, they waited, they prayed, and before they set foot on land, they acknowledged the one who would guide their steps. Their acknowledgement was not mere ceremony. It was both precedent and pattern for our style of life in the New World. In the name of God, amen, they began that first written articulation of a political philosophy in the English colonies that has served as an impetus for the American political experience for 400 years. At the heart of this formula is the understanding that God and God's law, however it's known, is normative for human action, and that in the application of that basic belief and the translation of it into positive law, the common good would exercise a normative function. In a whole series of documents, from the Fundamental Orders in 1639, which was really our first Constitution, to the Virginia Bill of Rights, authored by Thomas Jefferson, through the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, that guaranteed to the inhabitants of new states the same rights as the original states, on through the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, this theme is repeated over and over and over again. We are a free people who recognize the sovereignty of God and God's law and the common good and its claims on our personal and societal life. The vision and generosity of spirit of those first Catholic colonists who arrived in Maryland in 1634 anticipated our Declaration of Independence. They established a civil government based on religious freedom and on God's law as the norm for this new society in which all would be free and each person's worth would be valued. Last fall, I had the great joy, the great pleasure of participating in a ceremony in historic Old St. Mary's City in southern Maryland for the unlocking of this first Catholic church in the English colonies in what is now the United States. In 1634, the Catholics established religious freedom. In 1640s, they built a church. In 1704, they lost control of the assembly and were outlawed. And in an effort to impose silence on the Catholic Church, the new government in Maryland revoked the statute providing religious liberty and ordered the church locked so that it could not, in the words of the governor, ever again serve as a place of Catholic worship. Well, you can imagine my delight when I joined the current sheriff of St. Mary's County, who arguably is the legal successor to the sheriff sent by the royal governor to lock the church, to unlock the reconstructed chapel and to push open the doors. I could not help but remind the huge crowd of participants in this event, it's easy to lock doors. We must always keep pushing open doors to allow the free exchange of ideas and to admit the place of religious faith within the community. The service that faith provides as the conscience of the American culture is the cornerstone of our American experience. And it finds expression in our deep-seated conviction that we have inalienable rights from the laws of nature and nature's God. A profound part of the human experience is the search for truth and connectedness. And the development of human wisdom that includes the recognition of God, an appreciation of religious experience in human history and life, and the special truth that is divinely revealed religious faith is our history. It's the story of our history. Our Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, offers us guidance when we deal with the relationship of faith and public life. However, to understand his most recent encyclical, we have to go back to his first encyclical, God is Love. And here he tells us the two spheres, church and state, are distinct, but always interrelated. The separation of church and state, as it has been long understood in our country, does not mean separation of faith and moral values from the public square and the formation of public policy. And the Pope goes on to tell us the separation of church and state opens the space necessary for both church and state to influence and form the culture. Politics, law, and faith are mingled for one very simple reason. Believers are also citizens. Both church and state are home for the same people. There is always going to be an influence of faith on policy. And that's what the Holy Father was speaking about, the space for both to interact. The church does not pursue her mission or function by becoming involved in civil government or by taking sides in partisan politics. Rather, the function of faith is one of persuasion. The church teaches and teaches and continues to teach. And it's out of the formation of conscience that comes a good and just society in practice, in policy, in public structure. We stand with many of our brothers and sisters of a wide range of religious traditions in recognizing the existence of God, God's providential plan at work in the world, and the wisdom of God written in our heart. And we recognize there is an objective norm against which we can measure our political activity, our social activity, our cultural activity. Otherwise, if there is no objective norm, then in a democracy, what counts is the majority of votes that determine right and wrong, and in other forms of government, simply force, which gives rise to that ancient dictum, might makes right. It was precisely out of this understanding that you and I just take for granted there is an objective moral order, that at the end of the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials made an appeal not to the fact that the Allies had won, but that there is such a thing as a crime against humanity. An appeal to an objective moral order. It's written into the very fabric of our national history. Cardinal Ratzinger, years ago, in his essay Conscience and Truth, points out that something is missing in that perceived opposition between external authority and subjective conviction. And he said what's missing in our culture is the recognition that there is a truth that can make a claim both on our subjective and on our external authority. Religious faith has long held a seat at the table of those institutions and realities which form our culture. Religious faith reminds society of the criteria of civilization, of what is meant when we say one is truly human, and then to act in accord with humanity. The principles of the distinction of church and state is not intended to threaten society. In fact, society is strengthened by the very voice of conscience, of church, of faith. The recent film, 9 Days That Changed the World, describing the first visit of Pope John Paul II to Poland, presents vividly an account of how that historic 9-day pilgrimage in June of 1979 created a revolution of conscience that transformed Poland and fundamentally reshaped the spiritual and political landscape of the 20th century. I cite it because it is so instructive for us today. In spite of a decades-long effort on the part of the communist government to bleach out of the memory of Poles their history, their faith, and their culture, the arrival of the Church's first Polish Pope reawakened the soul of the nation. Millions of Poles, almost 1/3 of the whole population of the country, turned out to see the Holy Father in person, while the rest of the country followed on television and radio. Within 16 months, Solidarity became the first officially recognized free trade union in the totalitarian communist bloc, with over 10 million members. The momentum of that visit would eventually bring down the Berlin Wall and lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And what was at the heart of it? The Holy Father simply stood in the square in Warsaw and said, no one can take from you your history, your culture, your faith, your identity. In the film, we're told for 14 minutes, those 3 million people applauded, as if to say it took us decades to be able to show that that in fact is true. No one can take from us unless we let them. Our heritage, our history, our identity, our faith. In the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes how that whole construct of KGB oppression, he says the whole thing was built on falsehood. And the whole thing would have collapsed like a house of cards if the first day the 2 agents of the KGB arrived at an apartment house to arrest someone, if everyone had simply opened the doors and said, "Go away. Go away." It didn't happen. This Center for Faith and Culture addresses the defining issues of our day. And out of the realization of who we are as a people, with a history, a story, a future, this enterprise recognizes that no one person, no part of our society, no people can become isolated, cut off from its history, its defining experience of life, from its highest aspirations, from the lessons of faith and the inspiration of religion, from the very soil that sustains our life, and still expect to grow and flourish. Faith convictions, moral values, defining religious experience of life sustain the vitality of the whole society. We never stand alone, disconnected, uprooted, at least not for long. As we make our way through these reflections, I want to turn briefly to our attention to the current effort to bleach all of that out of our history, to bleach all of that out of our current moment, to bleach out, to abstract from all the religious influence that is a part of our history. Every culture in human history that has endured has recognized as innate to the human experience the need for a transcendent authority to sanction ultimately right and wrong. The secular model alone isn't sufficient to sustain a true reflection on who we are as a people and how we recognize right from wrong. And today, I believe, we live in a moment of time when we witness a movement in some opinion forums away from that appreciation of basic religious values. 9 years ago, shortly after 9/11, a memorial service was held in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, for the families of the heroic passengers of United Airlines Flight 93. A priest, a rabbi, and 2 ministers were exhorted by the government official presiding over all of that not to mention God, lest we embroil everyone in a church-state problem. The young priest who succeeded your archbishop as pastor of the parish that your archbishop founded years and years ago in Pittsburgh was that priest. And he began his remarks by saying, 2,000 years ago, Jesus Christ came among us to tell us how to deal with what we're facing today. And one by one, the other religious leaders that spoke out of their faith perspective to all of those mourners who had come looking for that very perspective that gives meaning to who we are and what we do. In recent years, we've witnessed a movement expressed in some public opinion voices away from this appreciation of basic religious values that underpin our laws. More recently, in fact, this has taken almost an absurd position. Earlier this month, we had the Red Mass in Washington, and the Vice President and 5 members of the Supreme Court and a large number of members of the judiciary came to the Mass. We were picketed. Now, that's not unusual. Almost any church service today, if a bishop shows up, has to be validated by some picketer. But this was a group across the street claiming to be atheists. And their argument was that separation of church and state would prohibit any public official from expressing religious faith. It's absurd, but it was the story that made it into the news. I said to our communications person, why don't we just say, don't worry about it. As far as you're concerned, they're all praying to somebody who isn't there. But our communications people are far more serious. Said you can't say that. The separation of church and state was precisely to allow for the flourishing of faith that in turn would impact on the state, specifically because religious faith and political preference are the expression of the same individual human being. We must assume the influence of religion on the actions of the state, because the same person who is a citizen is also a believing member of a faith community. There's no way you can separate those out, bleach those out, and still be realistically, authentically in touch with reality. The secular view of life being imposed on our diverse, pluralistic society causes us to support all the more a center of culture and faith, calls us to reflect all the more on who we are and how our history is woven into a fabric that includes the threads of religious experience. I believe that this current effort to go in a different direction will ultimately fail for a number of reasons. God is a part of our lives. You simply cannot, by any decree, simply remove God from the experience of people. This is demonstrated poll after poll, how many people in our country believe in God, have a religious faith. But we also need to be able to say that. We need to be able to express who we are, what our convictions are, what we believe, and how they continue to impact us today. I remain very optimistic. Each of us plays a part in the effort to balance what I suggest is out of kilter. And this is done by our own personal, serene, and firm affirmation of the things we believe. Faith and culture intersect because people of faith form the culture. If we have learned anything in our review of Western civilization, and particularly our own unique United States expression of American culture, it is the understanding that the threads of religious faith are woven tightly into the fabric of our nation. And that brings us to my final point. Our Holy Father's call for the new evangelization, a reproposing to the generation of today all of those beautiful, wonderful, faith-filled maxims that have guided life since those pilgrims announced, "In the name of God, amen," and began this experience. My own hope is that all of us will see the new evangelization as a lens through which we see everything we're doing, but now in the light of our understanding of how important it is for each of us to tell the story, share the excitement, and be that leaven where perhaps the faith has gone flat and the salt has lost its zest. The new evangelization can be that outlook that impels all of us to discover once again the resources, to open new ways, simply to make known all around us, to this generation, the magnificent heritage that is ours, of faith woven into the very fabric of the land in which we live, a language that speaks of human dignity, human rights, a language that reflects our heritage. I want to note as we conclude these remarks that the same faith in God that marked our nation's beginnings does continue to thrive, to inspire, to form, and to identify who we are today. Since we are both members of the church and citizens of the state, we expect that our faith will be reflected in our public policy. We exercise our responsibilities in prayer for our nation, its leaders, its government, its people. And at the same time, we work hard so that gospel values can enrich our public policy. A contribution of this Center for Faith and Culture and its newly inaugurated Master of Arts program is precisely to lift up in our American democratic society our history, and the role of religious faith in molding not only the past, but the present and our future. This Center for Faith and Culture is a great gift. It's a great gift to our society, and it can be a significant voice in the future, in formulating, in preparing, in helping, as a voice is heard in national debates on any issue. What you bring is the reasoned voice of historical experience, confirming that religious faith, as a foundational part of our national experience, has to continue to nurture and sustain our society. Last week, I had the privilege of saying the invocation at the National Law Enforcement Museum dedication. And I cite this little story because, to me, it says an obligation of all of us. As the program began, I was asked, would you stand backstage behind the curtain so that when the program began, there would be the presentation of the colors, the singing of the national anthem, and then you could step out and do the invocation. And from where I was standing, I could see the young man who was handling the console that contained the controls for the light and sound, and he also had on an easel the program, so he could see when he was supposed to pull whatever switch. And he did what he needed to do. He pulled the lights, and the lights went down, and the light went on to the flag, and a voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem." And we began to sing. And this was the part that struck me. This young man who was responsible for this console and all these papers, all by himself. He couldn't see me because I'm behind this curtain. Began to move all of this so he could get up. And he's standing there with these wires and his papers, and he has his hand over his heart as we're singing the national anthem. Sometimes we all have to stand. We all have to stand for the things that are really important, even if we're going to be standing alone and no one sees us. Rooted in faith and aware of God's providential care, isn't that what we do every time we speak up for our belief, our faith, the role of religious experience in our culture? And isn't that at the very heart of this university and this program? That a new generation, the next generation, would understand as clearly as did those founding fathers and mothers. As God was with our fathers, so God is with us. We do this because we're a people of faith, a people of prayer. In our fervent and sincere prayer, all of us recognize our relationship to God and God's care for us individually and collectively. Isn't that the reason why we're able to say, God bless America? Isn't that the reason we put our faith in that prayer? We believe in God. God is a part of our history, our culture. And this institute will see that the next generation simply gets to hear the story of how faith has permeated every aspect of our life. So they too will be able to pray, God bless America. Thank you.